How's it going, Vishnu? It's great to get you on the podcast. This is the second time that BonFi, has been on the podcast and we're talking about it and whatnot. So I'm really excited to see the product and dive into it and everything under the sun, right?
Absolutely, Joe. Happy to be here and looking forward to the this. And
Yeah, definitely. So Vishnu, why don't we start with you telling my audience, how you got into IT, how you got into cybersecurity, right? Like, what does your journey look like?
absolutely. So, Joe, I came into the US about 25 years ago from India. I did my engineering in India, and at that point in time, like a lot of my classmates, and we wanted to pursue higher studies into the United States, and got admission into one of the universities over here, the North Carolina State University, the Wolfpack, go Wolfpack, and then came here, did my computer networking. Actually, my background was electronic engineering, and then shifted at that point in time, with all the dot-com thing that was going on back in the turn of the century. We obviously decided to go into deeper into the networking aspect, because it takes a lot of infrastructure to build all the e-commerce based on. And at that point in time, Cisco was just taking off, right? So that just after doing my master's, my first job was at Cisco in Silicon Valley. So started as a coder, a software engineer at heart, got into the bits and bytes of packets, TCP/IP, and all of the good stuff. And then very quickly, realized that what I really wanted to do was to get a good sense of not just one vertical of technology, or if you were to look at the OSI stack, you start with the infrastructure, get into the networking, get into the application aspects and identities, and then data, right? Obviously, everything rides on data. So I have been fortunate enough to explore all of these. In fact, starting at Cisco with the networking aspect of things, moving into application and cloud. Cloud was really taking off, and F5 was doing some amazing stuff, helping application developers. DevOps was taking off to roll out applications securely in the cloud. And then all of a sudden, cloud security became the next big thing. People started talking about not just CASBs and SASE, but also CSPM. Snap was taking off. Identity security became hot because now you're dealing with multiple clouds, multi-cloud architecture. And then very quickly realized that with the advent of Gen AI, data is now the strongest currency, right? So from cloud security, identity security became really hot. And then because of the recent trends that we are seeing with Gen AI and AI security, with data at the centerpiece of all of that movement, we have to really take care of data governance. And hence, I got together with Giddy and Danny. Danny was at CyberArk when I was doing identity security. And then I obviously was just curious as to what Danny is up to along with Giddy, and hence decided to join the forces.
Huh. Yeah, that is it's a really strong background in terms of like a variety of strong experience, within the different domains, which, I always tell people like when they're trying to get started in IT or in cybersecurity, I always tell them like you want to get as much experience as possible in as many different domains as possible, right? And everyone always wants to like get into cloud security specifically because that's like the big, that's kind of like the big overarching, umbrella now, right? Like infrastructure security is like that old
Absolutely.
thing. Anyone can do infrastructure security, right? But figuring out the cloud is a different beast. And, I still always tell them like, hey, you need to know, everything on prem, like that's when it's easy, right? Like you shouldn't be just jumping straight into the cloud. Like, yeah, you can go and get, your AWS Foundation cert or your Azure Foundation cert, all that
Mhm.
sort of stuff. But you need that strong, diverse background before you
Absolutely.
start playing in a field, right, where like anything can be built at any scale within seconds. Like how's it going, everyone? This episode is sponsored by BonFi AI. So I'll tell you a little bit of a background about how I came across them and how they became a sponsor of the podcast. So currently I work for a professional services firm called Avira Security, and part of my duties is to help assist my customers with their projects that they have going on and identify any key technologies that may assist them in completing their projects. And I have one customer that was going into a DLP process or starting off a DLP project, and they were learning that it was a lot more involved than they were expecting. If they were going to continue down this path, they were going to have to increase their team size, and they're a very small company. So it just didn't make sense. But they needed to get it done. They have a lot of data that they needed to classify and protect and ensure that they know where it is. And that's where I stumbled upon BonFi AI. So they come in and it's very simple. You know, they have an AI that's built for this sort of thing, and they really optimize the workflow in every way possible. Right. So that's how I found them. And then they saw that I was doing the podcast and they wanted to support it. And so here we are. Now, with that, they didn't tell me what questions to ask or anything like that. Right. They came on, gave their expert opinion, didn't direct the conversation or anything like that. They showed a little bit of the product. And that's really it. You know, everything that I say is straight from me. It's not choreographed or anything like that. So I hope you guys enjoy the episode. And if you want to learn more about the product, maybe you can introduce it into your environment. There's going to be a link in the description of this episode. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the episode. How in the world do you control that? Because on prem, that server's only going to hold so much, you know? Like there's only going to be so many resources for an on prem server. But in AWS, if you tell it, hey, spin up a million containers, I mean, it's not even going to think about it. It's not going to ask you to confirm, like, hey, you sure you want a million? It's going to be like, no, okay, we're raking in the money now. Let's go spin up a million for this guy, whether he wanted it or not.
Absolutely. And as I tell my son, he's now all into vibe coding. I said, dude, first figure out your basics, get into Python, learn some data structures and object oriented principles of object oriented programming, and then you're welcome to dive into vibe coding and do the things the modern way, right? So similarly, very similarly, getting that diverse background into how things actually work, how infrastructure, and getting that rolling out things at scale and not losing sight on performance, and then moving into infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, right? I've also seen days when even on-prem people were rolling out platform as a service through OpenStack, infrastructure and platform as a service, which is sort of the promise was to bring a sort of like a hosted private cloud with a similar experience as or automation, as AWS was promising at that point in time, right? But eventually, if you have to really do things at scale securely, without compromising security and user experience, cloud is the way to go. And under the hood, it is all those basic fundamentals that you've learned across the stack, as I put it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, like everything in the cloud is a totally different scale. You know, I mean, it's hard to even think about that. Like in cloud security, you know, it kind of started for a brief stint with like vulnerability management, right? And then everyone kind of started to realize, like, oh, wait, like these vulnerabilities don't really matter if the entire network is configured wrong, you know? And so, like, that's where kind of like the idea of CSPMs came in and started to like augment that, right? And now in cloud security, I mean, there's so many acronyms, I barely even keep up, you know? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I'm like a cloud security guy, like through and through. It's what I do for my day job, you know, which is probably bad. Someone hearing is like the director of cloud security is not keeping up with acronyms. It's like, okay, well, they're coming up with acronyms for stuff that already exists. So tell me what it is, and I promise I already know it, you know, that sort of thing, right? But
Absolutely.
with the advent of the cloud and the expansiveness of the environment, it feels like data security is a significant problem
Hmm.
that we haven't really seen before. I mean, you know, I'm trying to think, right? So, like back when everything was mostly just on prem or
Hmm.
in a remote data center or whatever, you know, like there was limits to how much data you would have. There was limits. Like you were smarter with it. You weren't just collecting every single thing. You were collecting what you needed, and you know the rest of it you were disposing of, hopefully in a secure manner, right? And then the people that are dealing with petabytes and exabytes of data, you know, that was like Google. It was, you know, a handful of firms, right? And I'll give you an example, right? Like I was talking with a company just a couple weeks ago and they were talking about data security. And I asked them, you know, all right, like how much data do you actually have? Do you know? And they told me petabytes of data. And I remember like it kind of set me back because back in 2014, I was talking with like wasn't a threat intel company. It was like a threat intel company, but for the federal government.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they were talking about having issues with storing petabytes of data and having it rapidly accessible. And now this random medical company is saying that, oh, yeah, we have several petabytes of data. Like it's just another day. Like, of course, we have petabytes of data. It's like, man, that is an extreme amount of data for you to try and sift through and categorize and, building controls around it. And I asked them how they were doing it, and they said, oh, we're not doing it at all. We just kind of hope that nothing happens, because like it's such a difficult problem. And I was talking to my data security guy, and he told me, straight off the bat, he's like, yeah, this is, on average, minimum an 18-month project of someone devoted to them. Like that's all that they do every single day, 18 months, categorizing data, building policies around the data just to secure it, just to figure out what you actually have.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, SaaS did this, and, with the mega scalers sort of helping enterprises, entrepreneurs along the way, right? So petabytes of data, what at one point in time when everything was on-prem was well in control, now it's not, right? And even that's why you also see that even cloud security companies that started as a CSPM, Snap took a broader term, and then they are also looking at data security as a very strong adjacency. But what we have realized at BonFi is that most of these companies are able to look at things in silos, right? So either at data at rest, which is okay, let me just go and classify, terabytes, petabytes of data, get that visibility. But then what after that, right? It is obviously a healthcare company will have healthcare data. A finance company will have finance data, and that's not surprising. That that's what they're expected to do. But once you discover and classify and get a sense of where the data is, where the risky data is, now that thing is obviously the elephant in the room is Gen AI and AI. Now, sort of that insatiable appetite that it has for data, it wants to go and sort of devour data wherever it is from an enterprise point of view. And now you're talking about fragments of data. It's not like data at rest or data in motion, but hey, I'm asking ChatGPT or Claude to go and figure out or compose an email taking customer or financial data from this file sitting in SharePoint because I have access to that file. Now the agent is now a proxy of me and accessing that data at rest, creating something, an artifact that I'll take, either send it consume it as is or modify and send it in an email or share it as a memo, right? Now it's no longer just that getting that visibility that the traditional data security providers are promising, or not just looking at data in motion as a silo and just looking at this email has PII data. But now what you need is a much more holistic data security solution which does what it's supposed to do, which is to secure the business first, right? Data is one aspect, or data security is one aspect of it. Obviously, other vendors are providing their domain expertise from a network security and identity security point of view. But the two main actors right now, or two main components in this day and age, is data first, and then obviously who is sending the actors, I would say. So tying these two elements or entities, as we call it at BonFi, and learning about the not just the enterprise but the universe that it is existing in, with all the partners, the vendors that it is dealing with, the employees, the insiders, and then the risk that they bring to the table as they interact with data at rest, creating fragments using Gen AI and sharing it. And then there is this other big family of data consumers and producers that is coming up, are agentic AI and the smart applications that enterprises are building. The developers are hungry to build way more smarter applications, leveraging all these intelligent models. So yeah, petabytes of data, traditional data security, obviously they do what they are supposed to do by design, but that's not good enough when it comes to doing data security in the Gen AI era, as we call it.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem like anything else on the market is probably even capable of keeping up with it, right? Because, I've had on data security experts before, and I think I even discussed this with Giddy, where, data is like the new oil, right? Like, where I wouldn't be surprised if countries end up fighting wars over data, right? I mean, that's a weird thing to say. It's a weird thing to
Where
think about.
rare material.
Right. Because it's so like transactionable, I guess,
Absolutely.
if that's a word, if that's a term, right? Because, you could sell it, you could sell the same piece of data, thousands of times over, millions of times over. It doesn't matter. It has reusable, characteristics to it. Now, I'm sure eventually, it would get so populated within whatever ecosystem that you wouldn't be able to sell it anymore. But, still like it's we're at the precipice of something, especially with, Gen AI and LLMs and agentic AI, creating, because now agentic AI is just essentially out there like creating new data for its users,
Absolutely. Yeah.
where it would have used to take, a human to interact with a website or a payment system to do it. Now a bot's doing it in, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, right? And then moving on to the next one. Like that's creating data at a scale that we haven't even thought of.
Yeah, I mean the volume of data is absolutely something that is happening. It's not something that is yet to happen. It is happening. But what's more important, Joe, is that obviously data without context is not as interesting. It's not as from a data security analyzers like us. So you talk about data and how it's going to be important, but even more important is what could be something sensitive for one business may not be sensitive for another business. So looking at data at scale, volume that is being generated at in context of the business is the key problem to be solved, right? And nobody is actually doing that effectively. Right, everybody, it's an overloaded term these days. That, hey, contextual intelligence, context have been around for the longest time, right? Like even at Cisco, when I was there doing network security, folks started talking about, hey, where's the application context? Because you're using Cisco gear to transfer packets from point A to point B, but for an application, right? Similarly, talking about identity security, you cannot be looking at identity security just as a silo, but the various contexts that come into the picture. Very similarly, you bring all of these things together and they actually form context for data as well, because at the end of the day, data is serving the goals of a business, the goals of entities that are actually consuming and producing it. And these days, obviously, in addition to the human entities, now there are machine entities that are equally, if not more, hungry for data in order to consume more intelligent stuff and in order to help the enterprises meet their goals.
Hmm. Do you think that this is the last question before we like kind of dive in and take a look,
Yeah,
right? But
absolutely.
do you think that now with Gen AI and just how the cloud is and everything, do you think that the scale of data that I talked about, with like Google, where Google is operating on a scale of data for decades that no one's ever even seen, right? I mean, they're coming up with new names for the amount of data that they're getting. And this was, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, like it was like that. Do you see the same thing now happening, but to like everyone basically? I mean, is everyone starting to get to this point where you're generating so much data, or you could generate so much data that it's basically unheard of or unseen, outside of like the big tech companies?
Absolutely. Even forget about enterprise, I would say even at a personal level, the amount of data that we are generating is probably, I don't have exact statistics, but probably are the same level as what enterprises were producing a few decades ago, right? So with the amount of data that we are obviously possibly producing and consuming, with humanly possibly, but also talking about the sort of data that is being generated and consumed by AIs, but also we talk about universal intelligence and AGI and all of that. Imagine human population getting doubled and tripled because each of these identities, non-human identities or machine identities, will have their own memory, will have their own contexts, right? So just like you and I, we have all sorts of stuff in our brains, like with all our experience, the knowledge that we gather. Now, each of us now create a clone of each one of us just as a very simple math. And each one of those machine identities also having access to that data that we have not normally have, but also storing that as memory and storing those historical contexts. We're talking about humongous amounts of data that we'll all have to manage and obviously secure as well.
Wow, that's crazy to think about. I didn't even think about it like that, right? Where potentially the AI agents are learning from prior experiences, probably like under the guise or an understanding that it makes it more efficient. It's better at what it does. It learns from you,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
serve you
absolutely.
better and whatnot. And
Like the my chat GPT, the sessions that I have, it's not obviously the prompts are interesting, the responses are interesting, but also over many sessions that I've had with chat GPT, for example, it knows me, right? It
yeah,
knows my areas of interest, what I'm usually looking for, uh, my parameter, my attributes that I look for in products and technologies. So it's not like your chat GPT will be catered to your preferences and your requirements, right? Similarly for me, so it is going to be, I would say, a human population quadrupled, right? And then imagine the amount of data, the amount of intelligence, and hence the amount of security requirements that will be required, right? So it's just fascinating.
yeah, that is a really interesting way of looking at it. I mean, it makes me feel like it's like a step away from Skynet,
Yeah,
some
yeah,
Terminator sort of situation.
absolutely. And that's why knowledge is the gold mine, right? So how much you know about the entity, that entity in our case, let's say enterprise is an entity, how much you know about that entity, and then superimpose that with the data at rest, in motion, and use, and then you'll be able to really come up with some accurate risk assessment, right? And not just looking at the one-to-one mapping that I gave a few minutes ago about the chat GPT knowing about me is exactly how BonFi, think of BonFi as, BonFi knows Acme as one enterprise, and it knows its characteristics, its attributes. And then, BonFi knowing about any other enterprise in a different vertical with different standards, with different compliance requirements, and then looking at data through those lenses. So that's where it's not just about data at rest, in motion, and use. It is data as being used and consumed by an enterprise through its human and machine identities and entities. That's where the real solution lies.
It's really interesting. Why don't we dive into, the
Yeah,
actual
the proof is in the pudding, right?
let's take a look.
Cool. So basically, I'm logged into the BonFi portal. It's a multi-tenant SaaS solution. What that means is every customer of BonFi gets they get their own tenant on the BonFi infrastructure, and they log in. We have different roles, administrative roles, analyst roles, and if you see the GUI itself on the left side, it's basically divided in four sections. The first section is more about visibility, giving a very strong sense about the visibility into the risks that a given enterprise is exposed to, but also the risks from a data point of view, but also entities point of view. We call it ERM, or entity risk management. And then the dashboard is overall coverage of how BonFi is looking at data and surfacing some of the major risks. The middle portion over here is basically the infrastructure, the plumbing. We obviously connect to a lot of data repositories and enterprise data stores because, as we mentioned, we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort goes into learning about the enterprise, what we call as the knowledge graph, and we'll come to that. So through the plumbing, we not only have connectors to look into and learn about the enterprise, but also tap into the various channels, right? Whether it's a data in motion, which is an email, a connector, or looking at data at rest. For example, a lot of our customers are Microsoft 365 customers, so looking at data at rest in SharePoint. And then the knowledge graph is um, is basically the what we know about the enterprise, the various organizations that it deals with, the people that it deals with. Different segments will have different volumes. So if you're talking B2C, we're talking about millions of customers that this particular enterprise might be dealing with. We learn about the employees, the identities and entities connecting to their enterprise identity directory, for instance, learning about the groups, because a lot of enterprises do access control to data and applications through groups. So learning about groups and what comprises those groups is also an important aspect. And then the fourth section is basically about just doing operational stuff within the application itself. So those are the four sections, and let me dive deeper into the connector. So this is where we get started, right? So any typical enterprise customer would first onboard us by helping us connect to their identity directories, for example, right, through Entra. Right, a lot of our Microsoft 365 customers have most of their users and employees, guest users or employees in their identity directory. So that's where we connect to. And then we start connecting to other learning sources. For example, we learn about their customers through the CRM system. So Salesforce is one that we support. We have a support for other CRMs such as HubSpot as well. So this is from a broad scope. So this is the IAM where we learn about employees. This is the CRM where we learn about the customers. And then we talk about, and by the way, through CRM, you're not just learning about the customers, but also a lot of these connectors happen to be both a learning connector as well as an analysis connector. What I mean by that is we use that connector to learn about the enterprise, but also looking at the content. For example, in Salesforce, we're talking about cases that their customers are raising, support tickets, comments in those. So all of that is interesting to us because sensitive data might leak the organization through any of those channels, right? And then there are data in motion connectors, such as, for example, the 365 mail, where we are looking at emails in real time, SMTP server, where we are looking at emails that are being managed by SMTP servers as a standard in real time as well. SharePoint is where the data lives at rest, right? So we are able to connect to pretty much all of the sites, the SharePoint sites. We can go at an individual OneDrive level and look at data, various folders, and all of that. And what's interesting in all of this, as we are doing this, we are keeping the access model in view as well. What that means is when we're learning about a document in SharePoint, we are also aware of who has access at what level, at what privilege level to the document. And as and when those things change, we are able to determine the risk, not just from a data content point of view, but also access control point of view as well. And that's where the whole thing about content management, meeting contexts, in this case, for example, access control, comes into the picture. So those are the
Hmm.
connectors, sort of learning as well as looking at data at rest and data in motion. And then we're talking about policies. So this is where, you're applying your specific requirements from an enterprise customer point of view, where I would say the enterprise knowledge or the business knowledge meets business logic, right? From a risk point of view. So obviously, you are able to look at things such as, you know how you're looking at risk from a customer trust point of view, right? Are you looking at mixing customer information? So if you are let's say in healthcare, it's very, very important that you're not leaking the information about one customer to another customer, right? So you can design those policies as a requirement and look at a category of risk such as customer risk, a customer trust, which is not possible if you just look at content and look at just the risk associated with, let's say, PII, right? Because at that point in time, you're not aware of the relationships that you should consider when you're analyzing for risk, right? So that's where the policies come in. Pausing there for a second and see if you have any questions.
Uh, I'm not sure. So, like, looking at the policies,
Mhm,
when you mentioned that you could see
mhm.
if a user has, access to it, or a group or a role has access to it, can you then go, straight from like the policies, or at least the solution, and make the correction, and then it updates it, in Azure or AWS, whatever it might be?
Yeah, so that's the beauty of it, right? So we, as I forgot to mention, but there is an automation piece where we can actually automate some of the remediations that we believe should be available out of the box to customers. So, for example, if we find that a document has risky content, then
Mm.
not only we can provide automation to notify the right folks, but also provide access control through automations where we can go and set sensitivity labels, for example. In this case, now that we are able to determine the risk of a particular document in context of not just the PII, for example, but also relationship based risks such as customer trust issues or intellectual property leakage because you're sending a piece of content to a customer who does not have NDA. So now we can set sensitivity labels in Purview given that knowledge. We can also revoke certain access controls. So, for example, if we're looking at Salesforce, for example, we can go reach out into the Salesforce environment in cloud and make changes to the access control of a given piece of asset in Salesforce. So, absolutely not just detecting risk, but also providing automated remediations based on the risk that is assessed so that customers can go and make certain controls and changes to those sources as well.
Is it also making like recommendations of what to change? Because, I'm trying to think of like how this compares to, like, let's just say Purview, for instance, right? Because I feel like that's probably what everyone would ask when they're looking at a solution like this. Well, why don't I just go with Purview, right? And how does this, offer me more capability than Purview, and this and that, right? So that's just where I'm approaching it from, like, what I'm thinking of.
Absolutely. So, and this is what I alluded to a little while ago, that Purview obviously can look at data, like can look at uh, documents in SharePoint, look at based on their static policies and based on regular expressions that you can have in their DLP policies, looking at for example, passport format or credit card format or social security numbers and all of that. So it can absolutely detect those risks in the Microsoft ecosystem, right? What it cannot do is basically look at that risk in context of, let's say, if this, for example, if I'm sending an email to a customer and I'm sharing some sensitive information in the email, it can be going to a customer with whom I have NDA. So it is absolutely fine for me to send that level of information. What Purview will do is it will detect that sensitive information is leaving the organization and flag it as a risk, right? What we'll do is, hey, we do detect some sensitive information leaving the organization, but it is going to a customer who we know about through the discovery that we had from Salesforce. And our accessibility to the various attributes that that customer has in our system, and we know that we have an NDA with that customer. So putting those things together and then coming up with the risk assessment is far more accurate than what Purview is able to do in the limited scope from a data boundary as well as from a risk assessment point of view that it has the intelligence to do.
Oh, so you're able to build in context
Absolutely.
behind the data for your environment. Whereas like Purview is kind of like cut and dry, where it's like, is it sensitive data or is it not? Does it include a social security number or does it not? You know, it doesn't
Exactly.
even care like where it goes or where it lives. It's just kind of cut and dry like that.
Exactly. And we provide a very smart summary. So let's say this is how we are looking at an activity. So what I'm sharing right now is an activity analysis. So everything that we analyze is presented in the system as an activity, and then you look at the overall risk of that particular activity. You can look at the content that was, you can look at who sent this email to which recipients, and then you can look at the content. What's more interesting is, let me go back to the overview tab. You can, in one shot, look at the various policies that were applied. So you can look at customer trust, for example, which again brings in those relationship aspects. Whether the customer that I'm sending this email to, am I mentioning at other customers with whom I may have NDA with? Thereby, I'm violating that trust that I have with the other customer, for example, that I'm referring to. The intellectual property, am I discussing anything sensitive with this customer that I don't have NDA with? And then obviously the uh, the set of checks that you would provide, or check for example, privacy. But even within privacy, for instance, traditional data security DLP players will look at privacy. Hey, is there a social security number or a credit card number? What we'll do is, hey, is there a person whose address is mentioned and that person's address is in California? Uh, you know, I don't have an NDA with that person, or this person is not even on the email thread, and that this person is, because his address is in California, I'm in violation of CCPA, right? So putting all of those things together and looking at all the properties, all the contexts of entities that are involved in a particular conversation, that's how you come up with an accurate sense of the risk involved.
And where or how is that context kind of configured?
Absolutely. We have, let me actually go to the insights tab. So this is where uh, we you can look at the insights from how the customer would look at it from a runtime point of view. So you can filter by what we have as an entity linking as a stage, where when we look at the data that is coming in, we then look at that from the learning various analyzers that we have, and that's where our intelligence lies, right? Where we have built very accurate analysis engines which are able to slice and dice the content that we have just received for analysis from various aspects. And entity linking is one key stage where we can extract the various folks or entities in a piece of content. So, for example, Rebecca, we know is a person. How do we know that Rebecca is a person? Is by tapping into for example, the Salesforce enterprise store and learning from that stage when we flip the switch on. We spent a day just learning about the enterprise. We know that Danny is an employee with the role sending, because obviously he was found in, let's say, the enterprise employee store, Entra in this case. We know that Fleming LLC is an organization, and all of this is coming from the knowledge graph, right? So the knowledge graph is where uh, all the entity information along with the context, their addresses, the fact that they have NDA or not, right? The various groups that exist in the directory, the identity directory, and looking at who the members of a particular group are, right? So we know the members of group. And most interesting part is that for each of these folks, we have a very good sense of the risk of this particular employee. So for example, myself, I'm an employee at BonFi, and I can look at my risk, right? So BonFi traces, it learns about the entities, but over a period of time, based on the activities and based on external risk intelligence, such as other stores that are tracking risks from various other contexts, we track risk from a data security point of view. We put those things together and come up with a holistic entity risk. So all of these things combined gives you a much more accurate sense of when you say a data is risky or content is risky as it leaves the organization. You have to keep in mind not just what you found in that piece of content, but who was sending it, to whom was it going to, and the various contexts associated with each of those entities that were involved.
Hmm. So you mentioned earlier that it would, build in the context that like you have an NDA with a company and
Mhm.
whatnot. Is it, I mean, it's looking at like the data stores and everything. So I assume the NDA would live in there. And so it would see it and then it would automatically,
Absolutely.
kind of build that context in.
Absolutely. So each
Hmm.
and every
Wow.
organization that we learn about, excuse me, we we let the customer tell us what we need to pull in from the data store. So another interesting piece is if you go to the knowledge graph, we have this concept of a mapping, right? So and this goes back to the learning phase that we have, like the first 24 to 48 hours. The customer can tell us what do they want us to learn from these sources. So for example, if I'm looking at my Salesforce data, then I can look at the various attributes that we are allowing the customer to map from that source into us. And we have a normalized schema, what we call the BonFi schema. So all of these numerous, we're talking Entra, Salesforce, SharePoint, in future other connectors, they all normalize to the BonFi schema. And that's how we are able to then put together those various aspects to really find out how these things come together for, let's say, compliance requirements. For example, address is important when it comes to CCPA. The fact that somebody has an NDA will allow us to look at risk at an elevated or not level, right? Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Is there like a compliance pack potentially where, like you always see this in like CSPMs or CNAPs where, you could deploy like a HIPAA compliance pack and it tells you like how compliant you are with HIPAA across everything, right? Like I feel like that might be valuable to some companies to like get that single view. Is there
Absolutely.
anything like that?
So we do have what we call out of the box policies. So for example, if I go to the policy, you can look at customer trust based policies. So these are all the customer trust policy. We have a privacy policy, which will, for example, check for location based privacies. We have other compliance, for example, GDPR, which is very location based. Requirements might be there, for example, more stringent in the European region, thereby having PII leakage for GDPR, for CCPA. So we do have some of these out of the box available, and customers are welcome to use them as is, or they can customize it based on our own, what we call as content checklist or CCLs, or templates that we provide out of the box. So absolutely, it is available out of the box to any customer, and based on the vertical that they serve, or the location they're at, they can customize it based on those attributes.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I can definitely see a lot of customers like really, getting in and like to get the most value out of it, they're immediately like spinning up, compliance packs, so to speak, or these checks
Absolutely.
for, their requirements, and then just watching it as it analyzes. How long does it take to like start learning, in the environment from the time I hook it up for the very first time to the time that I start getting, valuable data from it? How
Yeah.
long does that typically take?
So I always like to tell everybody that if you want BonFi to work as, something that is just looking at data based on out of the box policies at real time data, such as email, it can be up and running in minutes, which is to say that, hey, just connect your configure your Microsoft 365 connector. Well, tell it the mailboxes to look for the policies to apply, and that in when it's looking at the emails for this account or for this mailbox, it can be up and running in minutes. What will be missing in that case will be the various contexts that it would need to come up with those intelligence insights that I showed to you. And for that, you need more connectors, like to the Salesforce, to the HR management systems such as Workday or ADP,
Because it builds in that context.
to build those contexts. So for that, and we strongly recommend to obviously bring those contexts in for to reduce false positives and for more accurate analysis. And for that, I will say maybe a day or 2 days at max for BonFi to connect to these sources and learn from those sources, build those contexts, build those relationships, know about, let's say, what we call as cross references, a group members. You go to the member and you know all the other groups that that particular member is, entity is a member of, and then bringing those elements of risk. Vishnu, who's a risky user because of his activities, the last 10 activities, is a member of this group. Then in turn, that group becomes risky. And then when you assign that group to access a sensitive document, hence just by that property and connection, that document becomes risky. So all building all that intelligence and bringing those relationships, I'll say about max 2 days.
So is that's really good to know.
Mhm.
Let's assume, right? Like, I have a company, they're just doing data security, and I am terribly, right? Where they're not limiting their users to what kinds of data they should have access to and whatnot.
Mhm.
In this solution, once it does its learning phase, and let's say it has all of the context available to it, if it sees that a user has access to PII data or PCI data, but it's literally never even accessed that data, is there a way to tell that within this solution so that I can then go and like remove those permissions? Maybe not obviously the removing of the permissions in this solution, but is there a way to identify it, right, fairly quickly, and then I can go and resolve it? Or is that just not built in yet?
Absolutely. So let's chop that into stages, right? So first and foremost, so this is the dashboard that I'm sharing, and you can see the various sources that we are looking at data from. And talking about risky users, you have a pretty good sense of the risky users based on the activities that we are seeing for these users. So, for example, if next time I see an analysis on, let's, for example, a SharePoint system, right? So I'm looking at SharePoint, and this is, I go to the document, and it has the title and what I was referring to. It has information about the permission model, right? And you can see the various groups, and what kinds of privileges that they have, right? So if I see that, there's a person or a group that has access to this piece of content, which I deem to be as risky or sensitive, even if that person has not accessed this particular document, I will know that they can if they wanted to, because I know that they have access, and thereby I can go and take corrective measures. So that's what we have today, right? What we are also building as a future, and maybe in one of our future podcasts we can talk about that, is more visibility into more proactive controls that we can suggest and recommend to customers, where you can say that, hey, this user or this group has access to this particular sensitive document or a repository or a site, and they have not accessed it in some time, and thereby we recommend that they can use one of their, for example, governance access governance solution to uh, in practicing least privilege principles. You should reduce the access of this particular group or identity to this repository.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. I don't think I have any other questions right now. Was there anything else that you wanted to dive into? I know that we're at the top of the time, right now, right? And I try to really stay on time with everyone that I got. But was there anywhere that you wanted to take me before we end it?
No, just that, in particular about Copilot. Uh, a lot of our Microsoft customers are interested in knowing about how we enhance or augment Purview to protect or secure their Copilot rollout. So we talked about labeling, auto labeling. So we do analysis of documents and then label stuff in SharePoint, and thereby you can configure your preview to look at those labels, right, and hence secure the Copilot rollout at a given enterprise, right? So that's one thing that I would definitely love to highlight, because a lot of our customers are asking about how do we secure Copilot given our contextual intelligence based analysis that we have.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I've seen a lot of customers of mine that like come up and they're like, "Yeah, we want to use this thing, but and we're already using it. How in the world do we figure this out? Because so much stuff is going on that we don't even know about in Copilot or ChatGPT or whatever LLM that you want to name."
Absolutely. And that's something that we'll obviously talk a little bit more about as we start rolling out more and more stuff to secure, in general, our AI analysis, shadow AI, and all of those interesting use cases, helping developers build secure, smarter applications using models. So we'll talk a lot more about that in the future podcasts.
Awesome. Well, Vishnu, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on with me and answer all of my questions. I'm sure that they might have been like stupid questions, but it
No,
was questions that I have, as someone that has never looked at this before or anything like that. It's a interesting domain and it's going to become more and more important, in security overall, especially cloud security for sure.
absolutely. I truly appreciate your time, Joe, and absolutely loved our chat.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, if anyone, listening to this episode is interested in connecting with Vishnu, I'll put his LinkedIn down below. And then, if you're interested in learning more about BonFi AI, I'll have the links to their site and a place that you can get a hold of them. Yeah. So thanks everyone. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. It was definitely very educational for me specifically. So thanks everyone.
Thank you.